Welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and if you are new to this channel, welcome, and I hope you enjoy these stories that we talk about from history about these horrible humans and all the awful things that they've done. If you have been following me from the beginning, thank you so much for your support, and I'm so glad you're here to share in these stories with me. You guys might notice my voice sounds a little off today. Don't worry, I'm just sick again. That's just kind of how it goes this time of year, you know. The leaves are changing, everything's cool and chilly. The spooky season, actually my favorite time of year. I know that's shocking since this is the kind of podcast that I am doing, but that also comes with a cold. So if you hear a little raspiness, I apologize, but make sure you're liking, subscribing, and sharing this podcast with anyone that you know that likes true crime or history, or even better, both. Today, we are going to be talking about something that utterly freaks me out. Now, we've all seen movies that depict voodoo in them, and for me, horror movies don't really scare me at all, but if you put voodoo in your movie, I'm terrified and I will not watch it. Voodoo freaks me out. Well, in today's story of our horrible human in history, it involves voodoo. In fact, our horrible human is actually a voodoo priestess, and she started a cult at the age of 17, killed 17 people and ordered the killing of at least 35 people. And all of that gets tied back to freaking voodoo. So tune in as we talk about the chilling tale of Clementine Barnabet from Louisiana. Let's get into this. Clementine Barnabet. She was born around 1894 in St. Martinville, Louisiana. We don't have an exact birth date. To be honest, we don't know a lot about her childhood because she comes from the poor area of Louisiana. So she was born to Nina Porter and Raymond Barnabet. So you'll notice her parents have two different last names. This was actually pretty common, and they were probably actually in a common law marriage because they were part of the lower social class. They were more poor sharecropping families. So they didn't tend to get married, but they often just became common law marriages because they would just live their lives together and have children together. And in their case, they were sharecroppers. Now Clementine had 3 brothers, and we actually only know the name of one of the brothers because he actually plays a role later in this story. His name is Zephyrin. And Clementine's father was actually well known to be abusive to his family. In fact, he actually wasn't popular in the community because he was known to be pretty violent throughout the town. So he had a pretty big reputation of violence and anger and abuse towards his own family. And the family itself was actually known throughout the town as filthy, shifty, and degenerate. At least that's what people would tell the police later when the neighbors were being interviewed with this case. But that's about all we know about her childhood and her upbringing. Information is super vague because keep in mind, this all took place in rural Louisiana in the very early 1900s. Many, many people were not well off. They weren't going to keep a lot of records, like there weren't going to be a lot of marriage records, there weren't going to be a lot of birth records because most people wouldn't be going to a doctor because they would just have the baby in their home because they wouldn't want to pay for a doctor. So there wasn't a lot of records that would be kept about poor people. If you think about history as a whole, we know about the leaders, we know about the wealthy people, and we know the basic information about the poor people, but you don't know a lot of specifics about any individual poor person. They just kind of all blend together, and that's the case throughout history, throughout the world. It's just kind of how it was, and this is kind of the case, but the only reason why we know about Clementine and the Barnabet family is because of what happens later on. So in 1909, the family would move to Lafayette, Louisiana. And we do know that Clementine was a very devout Catholic. And one of my sources even said that she often served in her community and helped others in need. And she was known to be a very good Christian girl. Well, that's at least according to this one source. Clementine eventually would break off from the standard Catholic Church and create an offshoot from the Christ Sanctified Holy Church in Lake Charles, Louisiana. So the Christ Sanctified Holy Church in Lake Charles was her denomination that she attended, but she broke off and decided to make her own sect. Later, you could probably call it a cult. Anyway, she created her own sect, aka cult, called the Church of Sacrifice. Now, Clementine actually became the high priestess of the church, which would combine her Christian beliefs with voodoo. Mind you, she was 17 at the time. Keep that in mind. This is a 17-year-old girl that created her own cult that included her Christian beliefs and voodoo. Now, I'll be honest with you. Like I mentioned, voodoo really, really freaks me out. But I do want to give you a quick history about voodoo to kind of clear up some of the misconceptions. Even doing this research, it still scares me. But just to kind of clear it up, because modern Hollywood has provided a lot of those misconceptions about voodoo. You know, when you picture voodoo, you picture the doll and people are sticking a bunch of needles in it, trying to like curse everyone. I mean, that's probably why I'm scared of it, is all the misconceptions. But after hearing the rest of our story for the day, I think I'm going to be vindicated on my fear of voodoo. Just saying. But anyways, back to the history of voodoo. Voodoo actually originated in West Africa, but was brought to the United States by enslaved Africans. It's a religion that actually connects people with spirits and ancestors through rituals like music and chanting and snakes and dancing. Practitioners create potions and talismans, charms, and those are often known as gris-gris. Most of the time, these potions or talismans or the charms that they make are used for good health, to help find love or good fortune. And most importantly, these talismans are to ward off evil spirits. So most of them are good intentioned and have good vibes behind them, I guess. The word voodoo actually comes from the Fon language and means, quote, spirit or, quote, God. So it's more of a way for the people who practice voodoo to connect with the spirits of ancestors or connecting to God. When voodoo came to the New Orleans region, it grew in popularity pretty quickly and merged with the Catholic Church in many areas, creating a voodoo Catholicism. And that's where Clementine comes in. She actually forms her own branch of voodoo Catholicism that believes that there is a way to become immortal, which is where our story truly begins. So in 1909, notice this is right after Clementine and her family moved to the area. In 1909, Edna Lucius and her 3 children were found murdered in their home. And a lot of people believe that this was the first murder that Clementine committed. But at this point in history, in 1909, when this murder took place, this was the first time anything like that had happened. The first time a whole family had just been slaughtered. And the police really weren't sure what to think about it. They were just kind of confused about the whole situation because they'd never seen a whole family be butchered like that. So it's kind of unclear if this is actually Clementine's first murders or not. So some people believe that it was her first murder. Some people aren't sure. But most people believe that her first actual murder was actually the Byers family. Now, this happened in February 1911, so a few years later. So I don't know. I'm a little iffy on if the first one was Clementine or not. I think it might have been, but we'll see. So in February of 1911, a concerned neighbor actually contacted the police because they were worried that something had happened to their neighbors. So the police arrived at the Byer family home, and when they entered the home to check on the family, they found Walter Byers, his wife, and their 6-year-old son all hacked to death with an axe. Yeah, pretty gruesome. And then a short 2 weeks later, Alexander and Mimi Andrews, along with their 3-year-old and 11-month-old children, were found dead in their home. They too had been, quote, brained with an axe. Brained with an axe is basically an old-timey way of saying that they had been hit in the head with an axe. I'm sure you could have figured that one out, but I like the term brained with an axe. It's a little intense. But there was a difference in this crime scene, however. So there's a little bit of difference between the Byers family and the Andrews family. And that main difference was in this crime scene, the bodies of the family had been elaborately posed. And just think about being the police officer that stumbles onto this crime scene. Like, you're just getting a call that people are worried about these individuals and they walk in and it's a murder scene, but the bodies are posed, and I'll explain how they were posed. So it was very clear to the police that the family had been killed in their beds because that was where majority of the blood was, but they had been moved after they were killed. The husband and wife were positioned in a way that it made it look like they were saying their bedtime prayers. They were kneeling next to the bed. And Mimi, the wife's arm, was placed around her husband's shoulders like she was trying to comfort him somehow. And then the 11-month-old, Agnes, had been laid on the bed right next to her mother. So this kind of freaked the police out because they're thinking that the Andrews murders and the Byers murders had to be connected, but the way that these people were killed was so gruesome and horrible. And again, at this time in history, there was no such word to describe someone killing multiple victims. But the black families in the area were becoming very terrified because it was specifically black families that were being murdered. And there seemed to be no connection between these two families other than they were both murdered. So it seemed like whoever was doing this was picking families, whole families at random and just killing them all. So people were feeling very afraid of what might happen next. So the Sheriff Lacoste, he was the sheriff at the time in the area. He had a hunch as to who might be behind the killings. There was a man named Garcon Godfrey that the sheriff believed could be behind the killings. Now, the reason why he believed that Garcon Godfrey was probably the killer was because Godfrey had recently escaped from an insane asylum and was on the loose. And mind you, up until this point, they hadn't been looking for him, but now they were like, oh, he might be killing people. Maybe we should find him. So Sheriff Lacoste opened a manhunt for Garcon, which, again, why did it take the murders of families, 2 whole families, to try and find an escaped insane person? I don't know. That's a great question. But Lacoste ended up having to arrest Garcon's mother to get any kind of information from her about her son's whereabouts because she was not willing to talk. Well, it turns out Garcon had actually been locked up in a different asylum, so it couldn't have been him that committed the murders. Now, it's at this point in the story that I greatly appreciate the record keeping and computers that we have in our day and age. Because if he could have just pulled up on a computer, like, I don't know, people that had been admitted to insane asylums, it would have saved a whole lot of energy doing this manhunt and interrogating his poor mother. But back then, they didn't have that kind of technology, so there was literally no communication between any department at all. So, super interesting. But this left the police with 0 suspects for now. Now, it was actually a friend of Raymond Barnabet, so Clementine's father. It was a friend of Raymond's mistress who initially turned the police's attention onto him. The mistress had told this friend that Raymond had confessed to killing the whole Andrews family. And the friend got really freaked out and immediately went to the authorities. Now, there is some speculation that this part of the story may or may not be true. There's not a lot of evidence to man, guys, sorry, my cold is messing with my brain. To back up this story, I was going to say a different word, but I just can't tonight. It's fine. But what is more likely that happened is the neighbors started speaking with the police and were like, hey, that Raymond Barnabet guy over there, he's kind of sketchy. He's pretty violent. I bet he has something to do with this. You should go check out their family because their whole family's a little sketch. So that's more likely what happened than the mistress story, but it's hard to say at this point in time because, like I said, record keeping, not so great back then. But the police would go and speak with Raymond, and they actually ended up arresting him. But because they had no evidence to tie him to the murders, they had to release him. And because it was like a he said, she said kind of case where they were like, oh yeah, she said that you committed the murders. Okay, well, I didn't. Okay, cool. You're free to go. So they released him from prison. And about a month after Raymond was released by the police, another family was found murdered in their home in the similar fashion as the first 2. Now, I did forget to mention, I did say that these families had been killed with an axe, But what I failed to mention was every family was killed with their own axe. Every family that had been killed, the murder weapon was the axe that they owned. And it was left there because it was their axe. So the people doing the murdering knew that there was actually going to be a murder weapon there because people needed to chop their firewood, right? So they just used the family's axes. So super creepy. Fun fact, forgot to mention it. Sorry about that. Anyways, the family that was next killed was the Cassidy family. And it consisted of the mother, the father, and their 3 children, all killed with an axe. Some of the differences in this case was the killing seemed to be more ritualistic, like more thought out. And by that ritualistic, like I said, more thought out, there were actually buckets placed under the victims to collect the blood from the victims, almost like they were trying to drain the blood out of the victims. And they were also posed strangely, and it was a horrible, horrible, awful scene for the police to investigate. It was pretty traumatic because, like I said, this kind of stuff did not happen in this time period. And now this was the 3rd or 4th family that had been brutally murdered. So this was pretty horrific for the community and the police. After the Cassidy family was killed, the police arrested Raymond again, and this time he was actually charged with the crime and put on trial. And he was convicted in October of 1911. First of all, how was that even possible? They literally had no evidence against him, so it's very confusing that they were even able to convict him. It was almost like they just really needed this murder to stop, and they were going to convict him no matter what, even if he didn't do it, because there genuinely was no evidence to tie him to it, and he never confessed to it, but he was somehow thrown in jail for it. Well, the reason why, this is how he got thrown in jail, I will tell you. Clementine and her brother Zephyrin would testify against their father. Now remember, these are his children. These are children that are thoroughly abused by their father and would have zero ulterior motives to get their father thrown into jail, right? So they both claimed that they had seen their father come home late on the night of the Andrews murder, and he forced them to help him get cleaned up after being covered. He was covered in blood and bits of brain. They even said that he had yelled that he had killed the whole darn Andrews family. Sorry, I don't swear on my channel, but he swore, so you could guess what word he used. So that's what they claimed. They both testified against their father, and without any evidence, with his kids' testimonies, he got thrown in jail. It still blows my mind with zero evidence. So he goes to jail, and that was it. That's the end of our story. So thanks for tuning in. We'll talk. No, just kidding. That is not the end of our story. Those horrible, awful murders did not stop. They did not. They thought they would. They thought everything would go happily ever after. And it didn't. The murders kept going. Shockingly, they got the wrong person. So in November, literally a month after Raymond was convicted and sent to jail for the murders, the next murders would take place in the same town as the Barnabet family home. So it had been kind of scattered around the area, but this was actually in the same exact town. So Norbert Randall, his wife, and their children, and a nephew that was staying with them were all murdered, again with their own axe. They found the buckets collecting the victim's blood again, and it seemed ritualistic again, and again they were posed. But there was one slight difference this time. The father, Norbert, had actually been shot with a gun. None of the other victims had ever been shot before. So this was something different. And I feel like if this would have been a crime today, well, first of all, forensic evidence would have been incredibly helpful. But just getting that bullet would make a really big difference. But this proved that Raymond, not the killer, they got the wrong guy. And Sheriff Lacoste was super bugged, but he headed straight to the Barnabet home in search of Zephyrin and Clementine. They were the ones who testified against their father, but Lacoste had actually been kind of suspicious about Clementine a lot earlier in this case, the first time they had been speaking to the family. Why? Because when they had actually searched the Barnabet home originally, they had found a suit of women's clothing that had been covered in blood and what they believed to be brain matter. Now, Clementine used the same excuse as our dear friend Lizzie Borden had used to explain away any blood on her clothing. She said, "Oh, I'm just on my period. That's what it is." Now, at this point in history, kind of like I mentioned in Lizzie's story, any mention of menstrual cycle, menstrual blood, period, if you brought that up to a man, even today it's still kind of a thing, but if you brought that up to a man at this point in history, conversation over. They would immediately be like, "Okay, never mind, just kidding. Pretend like I never ever saw this. It didn't happen. I don't want to know. No. Even if it was a staggering amount of blood, a woman could be like, "Yeah, that's my menses," and the men would be like, "What? Don't want to hear it. Don't care," walking away. Because they didn't know very much about a woman's cycle. So it was a really good excuse for her to use. However, her story changed a couple times. So at first it was, "Oh, it's my period." And then it changed to, "Well, my father actually wiped it all over me when he came home that night. He put it on there. It wasn't me. It was my father." So at this point, the police aren't buying anything that she's saying because she keeps changing her story. She flip-flops. She's making up all kinds of lies. So at this point, the police don't believe a word. So since she couldn't keep her story straight, they decide to do a little bit of forensic science. And I know this is in 1911. But seriously, it's really cool that they do a little bit of forensic science. Now, temper your expectations because, like I said, it is 1911. So their version of forensic science is going to be very lackluster compared to the forensic science that we did. But the fact that they did a little bit, I'm impressed, you know? So here's their forensic science. Are you ready for this? So impressed. They sent the blood-covered clothing to a doctor to examine. And the doctor looked at the clothing and was like, "Yeah, that's not period blood. And yes, that is brain matter." Boom. Science. He nailed it. So there you go. That's 1911 forensic science at its peak. But the fact that they actually did check with a doctor to see, like, could you actually verify if this is what we think it is? That is pretty significant. So I will give them that. It's just kind of funny that their forensic science was a doctor saying, "Yep, that's not period blood. Yep, that's brain matter." Yay. Good job, team. Anyways. So during their questioning of her brother, Zephyrin, he was actually able to provide a pretty solid alibi as to where he was the night of the murders. Clementine, however, was not. She was not able to come up with an alibi at all. Not to mention that some sources say that when they first brought her in for questioning, she kind of laughed at them while they kind of described the murders, and she laughed about it. Which doesn't mean she's guilty. She could just have a really bad attitude and not care about people, but it's kind of creepy that she would laugh about murders, like families being murdered. So they arrest Clementine for the murders and threw her in jail. So now all the murders stop and everyone lives happily ever after. No, they didn't, because the murders kept happening. Shocker. I know you didn't see that one coming. So Clementine's thrown in jail. Her dad's in jail. The murders continue to happen. So in January of 1912, 3 more families would be killed. And they were always the same as the last ones. Murdered by an axe, buckets of blood, posing the bodies, etc. One of these families, consisting of Felix Bursard and his wife and 2 children, had one of the most bizarre of all the crime scenes so far. So all the other murders seemed ritualistic, but this was the first crime scene that made the killing seem religiously motivated. And you're probably wondering how they would know. Well, it's because of the crime scene. Police found an inscription on the wall that was quoting the Bible written in blood. It quoted Psalms 9, verse 12, and it said, "When he maketh inquisition for the blood, he forgetteth not to cry for the humble." Oh, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble. Sorry, I read that wrong. Anyways, imagine walking into a murder scene and seeing that on the wall. But in addition, don't worry, there's more. In addition to the scripture written in blood on the wall, there was a signature in blood on the wall. And the signature read, "The Human 5. Now, we don't know if that means there were 5 people committing the murders, or if they were consistently trying to kill 5 people, because majority of the families that they had killed had 5 people in the families. So they weren't sure if this meant, oh, there's more than one killer, or if it's just, this is how many people we're going to kill every time. They didn't know. And it's super creepy that was on there, but Lacoste is starting to believe that there are multiple people involved. This is kind of triggering things in his mind, which I would hope so, right? Now, the creepiest part of this crime scene is that the children's fingers were splayed open with little sticks in between their fingers to form like they're trying to show you the number 5. All of the children's hands were forced open to look like they were trying to show you the number 5. How creepy is that? And I will put a picture because it's kind of hard to describe, but just know, fingers were being propped open with sticks to show the number 5, and probably in line with the human 5, right? But we don't know that for sure. It's very creepy. Soon, these murders actually would spread across the border into Texas. So 2 families were actually killed in Texas. And this area of Texas wasn't that far from the Louisiana border. So it makes sense that it could kind of spill over there. But the police knew that these murders were also tied to all the murders that were happening in Louisiana. Now, at this point, I want to inject a theory. And I want to hear what you guys think is happening. So Clementine is in jail, right? But she is also the leader of a cult, correct? Now, we've covered a couple different cults on this channel. And one thing that is really common amongst these cults is the people of the cult will do anything for their leaders. Literally anything. And I think multiple people are definitely involved in these killings, and they were getting instructions from one person, Clementine. But I want to hear what you think. because Clementine's behind bars right now. Why are these murders still happening? And I think it's because she's instructing her followers to do it. But let me know what you think. But let's hear the rest of the story and see how this plays out. So the police at this point are at a loss. They don't know what to do because the people supposedly committing these crimes are behind bars, but people are still dying. The community is terrified at this point. So they're getting desperate to figure out what's happening. People become even more terrified when the news gets a hold of that crime scene that I just described with the hands and the inscriptions. And now the news is starting to report that the human five are tied to voodoo and voodoo rituals. And so people start really freaking out, which I don't blame them because I would be right there with them. Now, out of nowhere, just out of the blue, Clementine, who is still in prison, mind you, like has been in prison this whole time, decides that she wants to talk to investigators. She's ready. And at this point, that's when Clementine admits that she is the leader of this cult that is doing all of the killings. She said that she had been the one to orchestrate all of the killings and also admitted to killing 17 people of the 35 people that she ordered killed. She said she did it herself, those 17. So here's the part of the story that is really interesting. So Clementine claimed that she had received a hoodoo or a talisman from a man who was a local voodoo priest. He promised that the talisman would protect her from the police and discovery, so she wouldn't be discovered if she committed any kind of crime. So basically, she could do whatever she wanted and the police would never catch her. And just a clarification, a hoodoo is different than voodoo. A hoodoo is more of the folk magic part of voodoo. It's more of the magical part of voodoo. So just a clarification. So Clementine claimed that before she used the talisman or this medallion or whatever it was he gave her, that she went back to the man to ensure that she would indeed have protection from discovery, no matter what she did. And he absolutely reassured her that no matter what, she would never be discovered. She claimed that because she had this medallion or talisman, that she believed she would never be caught for the murders. And she gave the police the name of the man who gave her the talismans. His name was Joseph Thibodeau. And when they asked her where she got it, she directed them straight to Joseph. And so obviously the police wanted to follow up with Mr. Thibodeau. And they found him and asked him if what Clementine had said was true about giving her a magical amulet that would keep her safe from detection. Well, he emphatically denied that he had anything to do with her. He said he wasn't into voodoo and he was just a local herbalist that would help people with healing herbs, and that's it. He was all about the roots and the herbs and, natural healing. He had nothing to do with hoodoo and voodoo and all of those things. Well, I personally, and this is my personal opinion, think he lied to the police. And I'm guessing he probably actually did give her something like that. But he did not want to be tied to these murders because he probably recognized, well, I gave her this thing and all of a sudden these murders started happening. I want no connection to this. So I'm sure he lied to protect his own skin, which makes sense. But just to claim that, oh, I just like herbs. Whatever, man. We know what you're doing. We know. So in her confession, she let police know that the reason she had ordered all of these killings was because her and her followers believed that by killing people, they could use the human sacrifice to become immortal. Yeah, I'm not really sure how this works. Like, as I thought about it and processed it, I was like, how do you logically come to that conclusion? Do they think by killing them they'll get their life essence, or they'll somehow be granted immortality through some magical being or something? I just want to know the logic behind, if I murder all these people, including children, I will be immortal. Because I don't see the logic. She also said that they would only kill people who went against the church. But oddly enough, there is no evidence to show that most, if not all of the victims, had no known association with the church, aka their cult, and had no connection to Clementine at all. They were just random people. So she tried to act like she was going to be super cooperative with the police and gave authorities a whole list of names of people who were her accomplices. Well, when they started trying to investigate these names, they either didn't exist or they were impossible to find, so they probably didn't exist. So they didn't trust anything that she was saying. And it's pretty safe to say that Clementine's covering. She's covering for people. We don't know who, we don't know why, but it's pretty obvious that that is what she's doing. But she also might just be crazy. So hear me out. What if this cult isn't actually real and it's all just in her mind? And none of these people exist and she did all of this on her own. Huh? What about that? Because there is no proof that there were actually other members of this cult, because they never found anyone else. They never charged anyone else with these murders. So, but there had to be, because the killings continued to happen while she was in jail. So there is that big form of proof. Anyways, so none of the names that she gave existed except for one, Reverend Thomas, or Thompson. Sorry, not Thomas. So Reverend Thompson said that he had converted many people to what he called the sect of sacrifice, which is different than the cult Clementine claimed to be a part of. She had been a follower of the Reverend Thompson before she formed her own sect. In his sect, the sect of sacrifice, they believed that once you were sanctified, and I don't know what that means, I don't know what that entails, they just believe when you were sanctified, whatever that means, you can no longer sin against God. Literally, you could do anything, including murder, and it wouldn't be viewed as a sin by God. So imagine Clementine has this belief that no matter what she does, she's not sinning against God. And she has a talisman that's going to protect her from punishment from the police. She basically feels like she is invincible. Unfortunately for her, she isn't, and it didn't work. But Reverend Thompson was never arrested. The police found nothing suspicious about him, even though Clementine had given them his name. So they let him go, didn't prosecute him or anything. So it was just another dead end that Clementine had led them to. But it does kind of help us have a little bit more context as to her beliefs and maybe why she was a little gung-ho about committing murders. So, one thing I do want to mention is, remember her bloody clothing that we mentioned before? Well, Clementine, again, I don't know how much to believe from this woman, but she claimed that when she committed the murders, she would actually dress up like a man. That way she could move around more freely at night. So she claimed that she dressed up like a man, so there's no way she could get blood and brains on her dress because she was always dressed like a man. So that's something that has to be explained. My explanation is Clementine's a liar, but there could be a different explanation. I don't know. So just wanted to provide that information before we continue on, because there's just so many lies in this case. I don't know what to believe. So Clementine is often known as the first African-American woman to be a serial killer here in the United States, with a death toll of 35 people. She's also known as the Voodoo Priestess, who sought eternal life by killing those people. Now, what became of this voodoo murdering priestess? Well, the press said that during her testimony in court, she was emotionless and detached, and would even roll her eyes and laugh about the crimes she was accused of. So, was she forced into a confession by the police? That is a question that a lot of historians have. Like, they just wanted someone to pin these murders on. So, did they coerce her into giving this testimony? Was she wanting attention? Because, like I said, she had been abused by her father, and this could have been a way to try and get attention, or a way to escape from her abusive father. It's really hard to tell with her. Like, we don't really know when she's being honest and when she's not, just because she lies all the time. So even in the newspapers, they mentioned that her confession was given with a grain of salt because everyone knew that she was just a liar. So even though most people didn't trust her confession, a jury would find her guilty, and she would receive a life sentence. And at the ripe old age of 19 years old, she began her sentence in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Now, in 1913, she actually tried to escape prison, but she did not even make it to the outside gate before she got caught. She tried hard, but it didn't work. But after she tried to escape, she became a model prisoner. She followed all the rules. She became a good member of the prison society. And only 10 years after she was sentenced, she was released back into the public. 10 years. For a woman who helped get 35 people murdered. Like, how and why was she released? Well, let me tell you, it's because they performed an undisclosed quote-unquote surgery that cured her of her evil, villainous ways, and she was okay to go back into society. Whatever this mysterious surgery was, it supposedly had cured her. Now, we genuinely don't know what this surgery was. But I have a hunch, as do many other people, as to what surgery this actually was. I personally believe that it was actually a frontal lobotomy. Now, technically, the frontal lobotomy was not a medical procedure that was in common use until the 1930s. But if you think about medical practices, so this is in like the late 19 teens to early 1920s that this would have happened. So like 1923 is when she was let out. But anyways, any medical experiment or anything usually has a lead up before it becomes a common practice in the medical scene. So my guess is that she was an experiment of the prison system, because a lot of times in history for medical tests, they often use prisoners as their test dummies because they were free human beings that were degenerates, and it was okay to do these things to them. It wasn't okay. P.S. I don't agree with that. That's just how they felt at the time. So it wouldn't surprise me if they had actually performed a frontal lobotomy on Clementine before it became common practice in the United States. So that's what I think what happened to her. There's no proof that that's what happened to her, but it was an undisclosed surgery and it changed her personality. So that's probably what happened. Anyways, after Clementine was released, she just kind of disappears from history. So we don't actually know what happened to her after that. There was a Redditor that claimed that her grandmother was Clementine. She said her grandmother's photo looked very similar to Clementine's, and her grandmother, before she passed away, started talking about the details of the case. So could this person be Clementine? We might not ever know because she has already passed away. We have no solid proof of anything. We genuinely don't know what happened to Clementine. So, because she created a cult, whether it was real or not, and had multiple African American families slaughtered and butchered, Clementine Barnabet is our horrible human in history for the week. So if you liked this story, please be sure you like and subscribe. Share this podcast with anyone else that you would like to hear these creepy stories. Sorry again about my voice. It's still trying to recover from an illness, so thank you for your patience. But next week, I know I say this every single week, but I am excited for next week because this individual is someone that I studied pretty heavily in my graduate program, and he is one of the worst people that I've ever learned about because this person killed an estimated 6 to 45 million people. This person ended up dying alone in a puddle of his own pee, which he deserved after killing so many people. Who are we talking about? We are going to be talking about Joseph Stalin, and it is going to be epic. So make sure you tune in next week. Thanks for tuning in this week. I hope you enjoyed the story, and we will see you guys soon.